And we're back. I'm Lisa Smith. This is live from the Heartland. We broadcast live, of course, from the Heartland Cafe at the corner of Rogers and Park, Glenwood and Lunt in Rogers Park. And my next guest is here to talk about the case for charter schools. Professor Kenneth Saltman, DePaul University's Department of Educational Studies. Thank you for coming today. Good morning. Professor Saltman, I have to admit that a lot of people, Mayor Daley, for instance, think that Chicago's public school system is broken. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. And that charter schools and busting the teachers union is the answer. Just tear it down, build something new from scratch. Now, I invited you on this show because you wrote a real barn burner of a letter to the Chicago Reader about charter schools and unions. And But before we get into the details of your article, or it's actually not an article, it's a letter to the editor, I guess. Maybe let's clarify a couple of things. When we hear about the privatization of public schools, that's what people are calling it. But charter schools aren't really private schools in the traditional sense, where individual families pay tuition for the fees for their child. So can you explain how, or just fundamentally, how are charter schools different from public and earlier models of private schools? Let's just get that clear.
Sure. Charter schools are publicly funded schools that are often exempt from usual district regulations, and charters differ from, say, CPS schools by not having to be constrained by a number of CPS requirements. They're different from vouchers.
Well, right. So when you send it, but a lot of us, when we say privatization, with charter schools, we're really talking about a different kind of privatization, right? We're talking about sort of the capitalist model of private.
Yeah. Charters are I would argue that they're part of the privatization movement in the sense that
just like prisons and.
Yeah. Charters. Well, there's a couple of ways. One is that about a third to a quarter of charter schools are for-profit schools nationally. Most of the new charter schools, most of the new for-profit schools that are being opened nationally are being opened as charter schools. So a lot of critics, Alex Molnar, for example, is a leading school commercialism critic, argues that charter schools represent one of the leading forms that school privatization takes. So nationally, many of these new charter schools are for-profit companies, which means that public money, tax money, is going to the running of the schools, but part of that's being skimmed off as profit for the owners of these schools. As one of the points I made in that letter is that in Illinois, there's a law requiring that the charter schools be nonprofit, and that would, on the surface, seem to suggest that Illinois doesn't have this problem of the skimming of profits out of public schooling. But the reality is that many of these nonprofits are subcontracting to for-profit companies who are doing this kind of skimming. So the skimming, what I'm talking about by skimming is talking about
let's clarify skimming.
Money that would be going for teacher salaries, textbooks, physical sites, transportation, on and on. It's going into investors' pockets. It's being taken out of the system. And the argument that's been made has been that if there's high enough volume, there can be economies of scale, and this can create efficiencies. And the Edison schools, for example, I wrote a book on the Edison schools. Half the Edison schools are charter schools. The argument is that if they can do enough volume, they can create the biggest district nationally, then they can save money by things like volume purchasing. And what I've looked at suggests that in terms of the cost savings argument, this isn't the case.
But why can't public schools do that?
That's exactly.
I mean, they have economies of scale too. I mean, don't they? Or they did.
There's no reason. For this. There's no advantage in this. In fact, what it does is it financially drains public schools. I want to emphasize, charter schools started as a grassroots movement for alternative and independent schools. There are people in Chicago like Bill Ayers and Mike Klonsky who were involved with the beginnings of the charter movement. And much of what's happened is the charter movement has been, in their
hijacked?
Hijacked, in their words, by business. And if you look in Chicago and you look at what Arne Duncan's come out of, he's come out of putting into place Renaissance 2010, which is a plan to put in place charter schools, some of which are run as for-profits, and the models not just for charter schools, but for school reform generally in Chicago, is a business model of reform. The Chicago Tribune just this past week had an article actually celebrating the fact that Duncan's tenure in Chicago represented the business plan for school reform. So let me insist that charter schooling is just one part of a broader ideological movement that involves imagining public schools as a private market. So
basically we're turning it into a consumer.
We're turning what is
the consumer model as opposed to, and a business model.
We're turning what is a public service into a consumable commodity, and we're imagining that parents and students are consumers of private services. And the only thing that matters in this way of thinking is what can I get for myself and my kid, rather than what is in the public good, what's good for everybody. That's one of the basic problems.
But now I need to play devil's advocate here, because a lot of people think that there is evidence that charter schools improve student performance and they turn out better students. So who cares, whether it's what the model is, as long as the end result is better educated students?
There are good charter schools and there are bad charter schools. There have been studies of this both nationally and locally. All of the studies show very mixed results, mixed to negative results on charter schools traditionally measured, meaning measured by test scores. There was recently a Stanford University study that came out that found 36% or so of charters are, quote, failed schools. That's a pretty high percentage, and Secretary of Education Duncan came out and talked about the need to close these failed charter schools. So there's been a lot of emphasis on charters as a cure-all for the problems with public schools, when in reality there have been really mixed results in traditional terms. Part of the problem is that these traditional terms assume that educational quality is going to be measured principally by standardized test scores. And this misses a much bigger problem with how charter schools and school privatization, with its emphasis on standardized testing, represents a fundamental shift in how we're thinking about teaching and learning and knowledge in ways that...
Right, but just to interject here, I mean, how else can they measure success? I mean, if it's not by test scores, how do you measure whether it's a successful school? I mean, graduation rates, sure, but if everybody only has to get a D to graduate,
then... that's a good question. One way you could measure success is how John Dewey thought of it, which was you could measure it by how it contributes to the making of a democratic culture and society, and you could actually consider
the educated citizen.
You could think about how schools contribute to making citizens who can participate in the society with others to make it better for everyone. You can measure the extent to which institutions become less oppressive and more emancipatory.
Is that measurable? Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Now I'm being sarcastic.
Well, it is measurable in the sense that you can drive around Chicago and you can see a lot of segregation, and you can see a lot of economic inequality, and you can find it in multiple institutions. You can find it in schools. You can find it in real estate. You could actually measure the quality of what public schools do as critical public spheres by their capacity to help transform broader social realities outside of schools.
That sounds really like it would be really hard to measure. But moving on,
well,
I'm with you. But
you might want to ask yourself why the insistence upon measurement. And
why?
We haven't had standardized testing for that long historically.
Right.
Well, what does it do now? Who does it represent now? One of the things I argue, one of the things it does is it represents a prohibition on thinking. In fact, because the questions of who makes the tests and what's on the tests and whose knowledge is represented and why, those questions get framed out through standardized testing.
There's a good book about that also, The Big Test. That's also a really good book about just the whole history of standardized tests and where it came from and what it developed into. And how that factors into basically, class stratification and that sort of thing.